At its heart, this book is a challenge to the idea that cities are in any sense decaying and corrupt. And it is, as you just heard, a challenge to the notion that the American dream can only lie behind a white picket fence in the suburb. Cities are remarkable places that play to what is most essential in humanity. Our greatest gift is our ability to learn from people around us. We come out of the womb with this remarkable talent at sopping up information from the people that are near us. If you're honest with yourself and you think about your own lives, I imagine that you will have the same feeling that I have, which is that so much of everything I know has come from connections with people, from the earliest ones to things that I learned 5 minutes ago. That talent that we have, that ability that we as humanity have to learn from people around us, makes us fundamentally an urban species. It makes us a species that thrives by being connected to other smart people, connected to people that we have an opportunity to learn from. That's why I think cities offer America its best hope. That's why cities are so full of promise, because they connect us, because they enable those chains of collaborative brilliance that are behind so many of the things that humankind has done that it's most remarkable. In the 15th century, chains of brilliance were able to produce artistic greatness. Think about Florence, 1500. Think about Brunelleschi, the polymath who figures out linear perspective. He passes it along to his friend Donatello, who puts it in low-relief sculpture on the wall of Orson Michele, who passes it along to Masaccio, who puts it on the wall of the Brancacci Chapel, who passes it along to his student, that less than saintly monk, Fra Filippo Lippi, who passes it along to Botticelli, and so forth. Each idea building on another, each new idea coming along. This, in 15th century Florence, created magnificent art. In the 21st century, it's everything, because America will only succeed in the decades ahead by being smarter than other countries, by coming up with new ideas. It is easy to feel, after 20 straight months of more than 99% unemployment, it is easy to feel in a country in which less than 4 in 10 high school dropouts are employed. It is easy to feel that we live in a country in which our economy has lost its way. As we look forward for America, we must realize that our future will not lie in the natural resources that made us rich in the 19th century. It will not lie in being able to produce ordinary objects more cheaply than they can on the other side of the ocean. It will only lie on being smart, on having new ideas, on being more creative, on being able to come up with thought after thought that will produce value throughout the world. That's a hard job. That's a difficult job, and we can't do it alone. No person is that good, not even Steve Jobs, not even Mark Zuckerberg. Indeed, it is a remarkable fact that one of the most famous examples of long-distance learning, Facebook, so clearly came out of a web of smart people who may perhaps have been borrowing each other's ideas at close quarters. That's not at all unusual. And one of the central paradoxes of the book, which I think in some sense is a central paradox of our age, is that changes in communication and transportation costs, the death of distance, the flat world, the fact that we can effortlessly telecommunicate across the world, have made cities more, not less important. We see that on the streets of Cairo today. We see this in a city where the future of the world hangs in the balance on what happens with an urban group. Yes, it was the Facebook revolution, but you couldn't have toppled Mubarak just by blocking him from your Facebook page. You actually needed to go out on the streets. You actually needed to go to the city. You needed to make something happen. And that is true in many different areas. If you think about what has happened with the decline in communication costs, with the rise in globalization, what these things have done is they've increased the returns to being smart. They've increased the returns to skill. Because now if you've got a new idea, you can produce it on the other side of the planet. You can sell it somewhere else. If you look at Hollywood's revenues over the past 10 years, they've been growing, but not domestically. They've been growing because the new ideas, the new art that comes out of the film industry in the US is sold worldwide. That force has increased the returns to new ideas, and those things are produced in cities. Those things are produced through collaborations. It was thought that these new technologies would make face-to-face contact obsolete. I can go through more of this evidence later, but there's, at this point in time, a whole host of evidence to suggest that that is not the case. In some ways, the way you want to think about this is that while more routine forms of information transmission are easily handled by the internet, by email, the most difficult ideas still require face-to-face contact. And as ideas get more and more complicated, as the need for knowledge of the most complex kind increases, the demand for those face-to-face connections increases. Anyone who's ever taught, I think, will share my view that the hardest thing about teaching is not knowing your subject, right? You've studied that in a few years, you feel comfortable with it. It's knowing whether or not the people that you're talking to get it. It's knowing whether or not you're actually speaking to them, whether or not you're getting through to them, whether or not they're actually grasping the ideas that have become part of you. It is extraordinarily hard to do that with telecommunications. It's extraordinarily difficult to do that without the incredible richness of the information set that comes from actually being able to look into someone's eyes, being able to read someone's facial expression, being able to read their body language, and to have a guess as to whether or not they're actually getting it, whether or not there's any sense of what's going on. As ideas get more complicated, those face-to-face connections get more important. But also, the other side of what makes cities so important is the fact that so much that is learned by young workers who come to downtown Atlanta or New York or London or Bangalore, right, is that are the happenstance learnings, are the things that you don't expect to have, are the unusual things that you learn by watching someone who knew their business and learning that's how it's done, or the even more important pieces of information that you get from people screwing up, from seeing what doesn't work, from seeing the failures. That flow of information, that maelstrom of insight is actually what makes cities work and what makes them powerful. And indeed, they are powerful, right? America's 3 largest metropolitan areas contain only 13% of the population, but produce 17% of this country's GDP. If the rest of the country became as productive as the New York metropolitan area, our national incomes would go up by 43%. Among those countries in the world where more than half of the people live in cities, incomes are 4 times higher than those countries in the world where less than half of the population live in cities. Cities are not necessarily, directly making wealth, but they're certainly part of the process, part of the path out of poverty to prosperity. Gandhi once said that the future of India was in its villages, not in its cities. With all due respect to the great man, on this one, he was wrong. That the future of India is very clearly in its cities, because those cities are the conduits across continents. They're the places where the knowledge of America, of Europe, gets transferred to India, and where the talent and ideas of India get transferred west. From an American perspective, Bangalore may seem like the end of the world. It may seem like a place that just has call centers with a bunch of disconnected people. From an Indian perspective, it's the quintessence of proximity. It's smart people right on top of each other, eating together in these massed areas where they're constantly sharing ideas and learning from one another. It's an amazing place, and it's a place that succeeds by doing what cities do best. Now, the relative success of cities in 2011 wasn't entirely foreordained. If you go back to my childhood in New York in the 1970s, right, it seemed like not just President Ford, but history itself was telling New York to drop dead. That this city, like all of America's older, colder cities, seemed like it was headed for the trash heap of history. Now, Atlanta seemed like it was doing fine. After all, no variable predicted population growth better in the 20th century than January temperature. And Atlanta was doing extremely well. But not New York, not Chicago, not Boston, not Detroit, not Minneapolis. And the way to understand this is that these older, colder cities had grown great on transportation networks. One of the things that drives me nuts is the view that there is something un-American about cities, as if cities weren't responsible for so much of the history of this country, right? The founding of the country itself came out of urban interactions in Boston in the 1770s, where the city's proximity connected John Hancock, who wanted to force a change in British mercantilist policy and needed a mob, with Sam Adams, who knew how to conjure a mob. And between the two of them, they were able to create massive amounts of change in a city, just as people are forcing change in Cairo today. In the 19th century, cities were the nodes of a great transportation network that made those rugged cowboys and those Iowa farmers productive. After all, in 1816, it cost as much to move goods 32 miles over land as it did to have them cross the Atlantic. Before that network was built, we perched on the eastern seaboard, desperately clinging to the waterways. But we built a network. We built it with canals like the Erie and Illinois, Michigan Canal that brought forth Chicago, the city that was the great linchpin of a watery arc that spanned all the way from New York to New Orleans and made it possible to ship goods east. We built it around Detroit, that great city on the straits where great industries like automobiles came out of an early concentration around the waterways. These cities enabled America's wealth, enabled the great rich black soil of Iowa to become productive, enabled the pigs, which were really, of course, corn in porcine form, to be shipped east through the stockyards, through the rail, and industry then formed around those nodes. New York's three great industries in the 19th century were sugar refining, that's the source of FDR's family fortune, garment production, and printing and publishing. I feel at the center of the book I have to mention that New York, of course, was a center for printing and publishing because the big money in 19th century books was in pirated English novels like those of Sir Walter Scott. The Chinese today had nothing on us. And New York had an advantage because the boats got there first. So Harper Brothers were able to pirate the latest Sir Walter Scott novel, Peveril of the Peak, more quickly than Carey and Lee were. This was a great asset, and again, a child of the port. Garment production, sugar refining, similar stories. Well, these transportation cost advantages, the fact that every one of America's 20 largest cities in 1900 was on a waterway, became largely irrelevant during the 20th century. Right, as transportation costs measured by railroad costs alone plummeted by 90% in real terms, not to mention the rise of the highway system, the rise of air power, whereas once it was vital to be next to those rail yards, that you had to have the stockyards right there, whereas once it was vital that you need to have the garment production right next to the port. That became irrelevant over the next 50 or 60 years. And all of these cities that had once organized themselves around manufacturing declined enormously. New York, it's important to remember that New York had the largest industrial cluster in the country in the 1950s. Garment production in New York employed many more bodies than automobile production in Detroit did, okay? And it was hammered, absolutely hammered, right? The city in the 1960s just hemorrhaged garment manufacturing jobs. And in the 1970s, when I was growing up, the city seemed like it was lost. The city seemed like it was gone. And yet it came back, and Boston came back, and Minneapolis came back. And there are two ways to talk about why cities came back and what determined which cities came back. One part of coming back is a set of stories. Which are the stories that I tell in the book. They're stories about smart entrepreneurial people who are connected by urban density and figured out new ideas. It's the story of people like John Abeel, the entrepreneur behind Boston Scientific, a good businessman, a smart worker, but not a man of scientific brilliance, who connected with Itzhak Bentov, a man who I can't imagine could have managed anything, with all due respect to the deceased, but he was the inventor of Slenderoni. He had his own theory of the expanding Big Bang, and he invented a steerable catheter. The combination of Bentov's brilliance, uncontrolled brilliance perhaps, with John Abeel's steady, clear mind, right, creates Boston Scientific. Right? It creates an enormously productive industry in Boston. It's important to remember how hard it is to predict what will make cities work. The one thing we know is that smart people who are connected with each other and have a spirit of entrepreneurship are able to do remarkable things. But one of my predecessors at Harvard once declared that unless the federal government bailed out the candy industry in Cambridge, and many of you may not remember that Cambridge was once a candy capital. These are those Necco wafers, which, from my perspective, I can understand why they declined, quite honestly. But those Necco, the Necco factory, of course, was a mainstay of Cambridge manufacturing. Now, of course, it holds a biotech company, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That kind of creative movement is a good thing. In New York, the stories are dominated by finance. It's a chain of ideas, better appreciation of how to trade off risk and return that comes to New York with people like Fisher Black and Jack Traynor, that enables Michael Milken to then sell high-yield debt. That high-yield debt enables Henry Kravis to undertake leveraged buyouts, and so on and so forth. The best example of this, of the power of cities to encourage entrepreneurship, is Mayor Bloomberg himself, right? And what Bloomberg does, which is so special, of course, is that he's a cross-industry entrepreneur. He's a person who comes out of finance, but becomes an IT billionaire, right? He's really competing with the guys in Silicon Valley, but he's able to do it better because he knows what the people in finance want, because he's learned that working at Salomon Brothers. He has learned that in the city. And he also is great because I think there's a wonderful thing about what he imported from trading floors to City Hall, which is this bullpen. Imagine, if you will, just people crammed on top of each other, right? Which is how he operates the center of City Hall. And it's basically the same model as the old Salomon Brothers trading floor. What's interesting about this model is that Wall Street traders are some of the wealthiest people on the planet. In normal industries, they would operate behind huge offices protected by, assistants of various forms, but they don't. They're right on top of each other. And they're right on top of each other because they want to know everything, because knowledge is so valuable in this industry. And that's why, of course, finance remains in New York, is because the extra bit of knowledge that's gained by proximity, gained by density, is worth so much in that industry. It's also, by the way, why the most tech-intensive industry in our country, the industry which above all has access to long-distance communication, is also the most famous example of geographic cluster in the world, which is, of course, Silicon Valley. That Silicon Valley was, sure, they can all telecommute in from across the planet, but every young software entrepreneur that I've ever talked to thinks that it's incredibly important to be there, to be on top of each other, to actually know what's going on, to be part of the culture of entrepreneurship. And that's absolutely critical, I think, to the continuing success of that industry. And indeed, the innovations that come out of these connections are, I think, critical to the ongoing success of America. But the comeback of cities like New York is not just about productivity. It's also about fun. And as difficult as it was to imagine in 1975, when New York, you had to pay people combat pay to work in New York, in 2011, my students certainly think that they'd rather be in New York than most other places just because it's fun. And if they're not going to be in New York, they're going to be in some other place that's enjoyable. That's also been part of cities' comeback, that when crime was reduced, when city streets were made relatively safe, this ability of cities to produce entrepreneurship and succeed has come to the fore. And cities have changed. I mean, at the start of the 20th century, cities were still killing fields. A boy born in New York City could expect to live 7 years less than the national average. Today, they can expect to live 2 years more. And there are two reasons for this among younger people, one of which is significantly lower motor vehicle accidents. Taking the subway after having a few drinks is just a lot safer than driving drunk. And the second reason is lower suicide rates. And it's an interesting puzzle that higher density areas have lower suicide rates. People in American cities don't actually say that they are happier than other people. It is true, actually, most of the countries of the world, the people in cities say that they're happier than people who are not living in urban areas. And it is true across countries that more urbanized countries are happier. But it's not true across cities in the US. But it is true that people in cities are much less likely to commit suicide. And that in of itself is sort of an interesting fact that says something, I think, that's good about our urban spaces. Now, the other way to think about what's determined urban success is just statistics. And I want to throw out something that I think is particularly relevant for Atlanta. That if you look among the older, colder cities, the one variable that really predicts which cities come back is education. Education is just an incredibly powerful predictor of urban success. Across areas, as we increase, as the share of the population with a college degree in an area increases by 10%, individuals' wages go up by almost 8%, holding their own education constant. So I look at just college graduates, I compare a college graduate in a less educated and a more educated place. They're earning more in more educated places. This is an important part of Atlanta's success, that it's very easy for non-Atlantans to just confuse every quick-growing Sunbelt area and think, well, it's all just sunshine, and that isn't even right. Because, in fact, one of the reasons why Atlanta and Dallas and Houston and Phoenix have added so many people is that they haven't done something that the older cities have done, which is to restrict housing growth. And if you actually look at the decision of many people to move to places like Atlanta, if you look at the growth of these areas, Atlanta and Dallas and Houston and Phoenix are able to do a remarkable job of providing affordable housing to ordinary Americans in a way that Boston and New York and San Francisco are just not. Okay? And the number of people in an area is intimately tied to the number of homes. And if you're going to shut housing down with 1 acre minimum lot sizes everywhere, or 2 acre minimum lot sizes, or heck, in some areas of greater San Francisco, they have 60 acre minimum lot sizes, right? You're not going to add people if you've got 60 acre minimum lot sizes. But Atlanta actually builds, and that's one part of the reason why it's added so many people. It's also one part of the reason why housing prices have not gone up in nominal terms over the last 10 years, right? And you shouldn't actually expect them to go up a whole lot if you're going to, have a fairly elastic supply of housing. But Atlanta is different. It's because it is, in fact, a remarkably skilled metropolitan area. And in many ways, it looks more like Boston than it does like Houston. That if you just look at the share of adults with college degrees in Fulton and DeKalb counties, or even in Atlanta, it looks very much like a skilled city. It just happens to be one in the Sun Belt. Now, there are other Sun Belt cities that are skilled, Charlotte, Austin, and this is a powerful combination. This combination of having sun, a relatively deregulated housing supply, and smart people, and actually having a connection with high density areas. I certainly understand that Atlanta's slight overbuilding during the boom has created issues, and I don't mean in any sense to be Pollyannish about this, but I believe that this region has enormously strong assets for long run success. But I think I'll just end on one thing that does give me a tad of pause about Atlanta. And I want to just say on this that I am, in the things that I'm about to describe, I am as guilty as anyone around. But hear my story and then I'll explain my own guilt. So there was a pleasant spring day in 1844 where a young Harvard College graduate and a friend went out to do some fishing and to have a picnic outside of Concord. The fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately, which made it easy to catch. And they cooked a chowder, and as the chowder was cooking, the wind flicked the flames to the nearby dry grass. A fire started, and the conflagration ensued, and soon there was a fiery inferno that had burned down more than 300 acres of prime Concord woodland by the time it finally burnt itself out. In his time, this young man was seen as being a great enemy of the environment. The Concord freedmen called him a flibbertigibbet, which, as far as I understand it, was damning in the years of 1844. Today, of course, this young man is now the secular saint of American environmentalism. That young man is Henry David Thoreau, who did, as far as I can tell, as much or more damage to the environment than anyone during his time period who was living in Boston. There's a moral to this story. We're a destructive species. It's a sad but true fact. And often, if you love nature, it makes sense to stay away from it. That in fact we have a great capacity to harm creatures that are around us, as pleasant as they can be. Now, there's a lesson in this for cities in terms of the work that Matthew Kahn and I have done, and this point was of course made by David Owen in Green Metropolis, that if you actually just go out and estimate carbon emissions associated with living in different parts of the country, unsurprisingly, carbon emissions are higher in suburban areas than in cities, and that's holding income and family size constant. And that's driven primarily by the smaller homes that even people with the same incomes and family sizes tend to have in urban areas, and it's driven by less driving. And it's important to note that less driving is not just an issue of moving to public transportation, it's also an issue of just driving around longer distances. The reason why I want to make it clear that I am not in any sense casting moral aspersions, and I am in no sense in a position of righteousness on this, is that when I started acquiring small children myself about 5 years ago, I moved out to the woods not so far away from Henry David Thoreau and started doing almost as much damage to them as he managed to do, although I've not actually burned anything down, but I certainly have spent far more time behind the wheel of a car than I ever hoped to in my life. Be that as it may, is if we think in terms of the future of the planet, the big issue is not necessarily American emissions, although they're significant, but the big issue is actually what's going to happen in India and China. And if India and China's carbon emissions rise to the level of the US level, world carbon emissions just from those countries alone with no increase in population will increase by 127%. Okay? A massive change associated with that. If you don't believe in global warming, and that's fine, I'm not a scientist, I'm not trying to sell you on anything, just think of what that's going to do, the cost of gas at the pump. Just think about your pocketbook on this. Now, if these countries instead rise to the level of say, emissions from Hong Kong, another enormously wealthy place, right? The Special Administrative District of Hong Kong is essentially as wealthy as the US, but their emissions are only a couple of percentage points more than China's emissions are today. If they rise to that level, the overall increase will be 24% in emissions, a very different level. And Hong Kong obviously is sustainable because it's not very green, because it's very, very tall and involves walking around and moving around. So I think as we look forward to the future, as we think about where we're going to go, I think it's not as if the point of this book is I'm trying to tell anyone who currently lives in a suburb to move into the city. It's not as if I'm trying to offer lifestyle advice to people. But I do think it's important that we understand how important our cities are to America and to the world. They're important because they create new ideas. They're important because they create all sorts of joys that come from being around other people. And they're important because they're good for the environment. And it seems even good for our health occasionally. And I think it's important for us to cherish them and for us to rethink those policies. And I won't spend much time on this now, but America does have a stack of anti-urban policies, like the fact that we strongly subsidize people to move into suburban homes and out of urban apartments, that stack the deck against cities. And I think it's appropriate to have I mean, there's nothing that I would wish for more in this book than to be part of a national dialogue on the policies that impact and I think in many cases impair our cities. Thank you very, very much for listening to me. Okay, let's have some questions. Certainly someone's mad at me. Yes? That's a great set of questions, in fact. So the question was whether or not the point, which is exactly right, which is that investing in the starting point was so there are three observations here. One of which I argued in my column on Detroit today, that Detroit made a tremendous mistake when dealing with its downturn by investing in infrastructure rather than people. That in fact the hallmark of declining places is that they have a lot of infrastructure relative to demand, and the last thing Detroit needed was a people mover, a monorail that glides over essentially empty streets. What it needed instead, at least in my view, was investment in people. Now, the second point which is also correct is that in fact investments in people are often do not benefit the places that invest in them. That in fact often the kids, particularly in declining areas, one of the things that you're doing with education is you're enabling them to get out. You're enabling them to find a brighter future somewhere else. And the third question was does that mean we should rethink our local funding of schools? That was the third question. So on the second point, I think it's exactly right. And I think one of the things that I try to make clear in this book is that it's a terrible mistake for mayors, for city leaders, to just blindly chase a will-o'-the-wisp of some population goal for your city. That, just once I want to hear a mayor say, sure, our population declined by 200,000 people during my term, but we educated the city, the children growing up in our city well, and they went on to great jobs in Houston and Atlanta and Dallas, right? Just once I want to hear a big city mayor say that, because in fact that is their job. Right? Their job, in fact, is to care for the people. It's not to build Potemkin villages that make the city look shiny and good. The point that was raised was, is there something wrong with the way that we're financing education? I think that's probably right. I mean, I think that, in fact, our system of local schooling has been a great curse to our urban areas. And, so many parents have moved to suburban areas to get the better schools that exist there, and that's not something that they should be blamed for. I think that funding is part of it, and I'm very happy with moving towards higher levels of state and national funding. I find that entirely reasonable. But the problem in most big city school systems at this point in time is not lack of funding. It's not as if just funding levels per capita tend to be quite high in these big city school districts at this point in time, and it's not as if just throwing more money at the problem seems like a pretty good solution. I should preface this by saying that this is what you're going to hear is probably a little bit more to the right. So let me make it clear that in the book there are things in which I believe that sort of big centered government is necessary, and there are areas where I think a little bit more competition is necessary. So one of the stories that I tell in my book is the story about how New York became healthy. And New York became the biggest job of city governments, even more than educating their students, is clean water. Clean water is job one, because if you don't have clean water, guys die in large numbers from like cholera and yellow fever and all sorts of plagues that have beset our cities for millennia. Now, there was a big debate in the 1790s about how to deal with the need for clean water in our cities. Okay? There were yellow fever epidemics. Philadelphia went the big public works system. This is with Latrobe. They invested heavily. New York, in a odd scheme cooked together by Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, of all an odd couple. You always want to be careful when two people so different get together on this thing. But Burr hires Hamilton because he's got a great scheme. He's going to have a private water company that's going to solve all of New York's problems as long as it gets a little bit of subsidy, so it can run as a bank. In fact, it's going to be a bank that's going to compete with Hamilton's own bank. Okay, so Burr can't get this through the Federalist-controlled city council in New York. So he hires Alexander Hamilton, who goes and makes a refrain that will be familiar to anyone, that New York cannot afford the burthensome taxes, and specifically it's burthensome taxes, that will be required to provide public water. So clearly, we should do it with subsidized private water companies. Well, Hamilton makes the argument, the Federalists nod along, can't afford the burthensome taxes, check. Burr gets his private water company. Okay? Private water company doesn't actually make much water. It does supplies a little bit. It's a murky quality, and it certainly doesn't solve any of New York's problems. The yellow fever and then cholera epidemics go on. It does, however, do very well at banking. It is now J.P. Morgan Chase. It was the Bank of the Manhattan Water Company, which became the Chase Manhattan Bank. So this was a very successful operation, but not good at actually solving the fundamental problem of providing clean water. Clean water was only provided when there was a massive public undertaking, the Croton Aqueduct in New York, that actually brought clean water to New York. And the problems of clean water, the work of Werner Troskin has been just wonderful on this, showing the impact of public provision of water on life expectancies in different parts of the country, particularly among actually African Americans in the South. But that required massive public spending, centralized public spending, a big job for government. Local governments were spending as much on water in the start of the 20th century as the national government was spending on everything except for the Army and the Post Office, according to work by David Cutler and Grant Miller. Now that being said, okay, now I'm tilting to the left. Watch, I'm tilting to the right. Okay. Now on schools, on the other hand, I think that we've actually seen that we lose a great deal by having a large, centralized public education system in our large schools. And I want to make this clear that this is not coming out of some ideological, thing of mine. It's coming from the fact that just the scores are awful, and we've seen actually progress from areas like charter schools. And the story I like to tell, or the example that I like to tell, is think about the restaurants in Atlanta or any big city. The food scene is good because there's a constant stream of new entrepreneurs coming up with new stuff. I mean, a lot of them are lousy when they start off and then they fail. But the surviving restaurants tend to be pretty good. And this is one of the great joys of cities, that you can actually go out and find some new entrepreneurs, come up with some new restaurant. Now imagine instead if Greater Atlanta had entrusted all the food to a single food superintendent who was going to establish a system of canteens that was going to feed you what was good for you, okay? Essentially, this is what happened with our public schools, that all of this great urban ability to create innovation and competition disappeared. And I just can't imagine, I mean, we've seen for decades now, some of the smartest people in the world grapple with the problem of fixing urban school systems. And it's just very hard for me to imagine any top-down system that's just going to do it. It's got to be a mixed method. It's got to have a lot of regulation. But things that we've seen, for example, in Jeffrey Canada's Harlem Children's Zone with the Promise Academy, the children who are randomized into this academy just have done phenomenally well relative to the people who are randomized out of it. And there are, of course, there are many charter schools that have not succeeded. But it's hard to think that the status quo is very good. And it's important, I think, to think about allowing some change, some innovation in this model. But again, it's not as if there's one right answer on this stuff. And again, I think it's important to think about different ways forward. So I'm sort of happy with the idea of more federal funding for schooling. So you do it sort of federally, and then allowing more choice, more competition among districts and more innovation of various forms at the local level. Yes, sir. There are people who like, leafy suburbs. There are people who like rural solitude, and there are people who like high-rises. But the point is that the more people you stack on a narrow area of land, the more management this requires. That there are demons that come with density, externalities, to use our language of economics. And the more people that you have in a narrow area, the more management it takes, the more government it takes, quite honestly. And that's in some sense the point of the clean water story, that there's a reason why people in Boston and New York like government more than people in Montana. They need it more, right? They actually require government to actually protect them from people who would rob them, and to provide the clean water that enables them not to get infectious diseases, and to manage the shared roadways. And it's hard. And we see these failures most often in the developing world, where cities are most vital. This is the great tragedy of places like the Dharavi slum in India. You walk around Dharavi, right, which is this amazing, for a while it was the largest slum in the world. Very dense, very low-rise area. Entrepreneurs everywhere, just everywhere, right? On one corner, there's a guy making brassieres. It sort of feels like you're back in the Lower East Side of New York in the teens. On another place, there are people who are sorting out various recycled plastics. I'm not so sure about the recycling of the syringes, though, quite honestly. But they're doing, and another group, there are people who are firing up pots with these beautiful, intricate designs, right? An amazing place that's sort of full of the magic of India in terms of just the human energy of the place that just makes you so excited and so hopeful. And then there are, children defecating on the streets. And then there are the unpaved roads. And then there's the uneven water provision. And the combination of private energy and public failure is just heartbreaking. And in some sense, this sort of makes your point that when you're going to do this, in order for the cities of India to play their job of bringing the city out of poverty, and there is no future in rural living in India, right? That way leads back towards famines and high levels of infant mortality and just millennium stasis. Cities are the agents of change, and change fundamentally in these places is good, but they just require more management. And the more dense you go, the more management you're going to need. I don't think we've reached it yet. I think Hong Kong functions pretty well. I think Singapore functions pretty well, right? But Singapore is an extraordinarily well-managed place, right? So Singapore, of course, has something that I think every Atlantan should be able to empathize with, which the roads are. It's one of the 3 densest countries in the world, and yet the roads move effortlessly because they've embraced congestion pricing. Because they actually charge people for going out on city streets. And as a result, you can drive at 50 miles an hour along crowded city streets. London, of course, has had also significant benefits from imposing some degree of congestion pricing. It's an odd thing that sort of Americans tend to believe that the right to drive freely on every road was snuck into the Bill of Rights somewhere by Thomas Jefferson. Whereas, in some sense, we're kind of running, from my perspective at least, it's like we're running a Soviet-style transport system, right? In the old Soviet Union, we used to, they used to have food in the supermarket that was priced way below the market price, and as a result, everyone had to wait in line, and there was nothing there when you got there. Well, that's kind of how roads work in this country, right? And that's what happens when you don't price goods that are in scarce demand. Yes, sir. There are very significant budgetary issues that all of our state and local governments face. These are quite serious. I wish that both sides, and both sides are guilty of this, I wish we could handle this like adults. And not be in the business of vilifying either side on this, because in fact, the people who work for state governments are, firemen are, my book, firemen are still heroes. So are cops, and so are teachers, right? I mean, these are heroes. These are not villains. And on the other hand, the guys who are elected by their constituents who are just trying to actually, balance a budget, they're doing their job too, right? I mean, these are people who are both trying to get things done. So on one level, I just wish we could, approach this thing reasonably, and also obviously with some degree of, a foresight for the future. One area in which I will talk about, and I know that this is risky. My wife has a rule that the 3 most boring words in the English language are unfunded pension liability, which I've taken to calling Nancy's Law in honor of her sage advice. But I will violate Nancy's Law right now and say something about unfunded pension liabilities. The problem is huge, and it's been covered up, I think, by very optimistic hopes about returns on pension portfolios. That in fact the problem is more severe than most of what we've been led to believe. The right answer for this, although it's a difficult answer, is moving from defined benefit to defined contribution plans, as private enterprises have done. The reason for this, I mean, you probably also have to match this with also moving state employees into Social Security as well, to have some bottom floor on that. But the reason for this is that without this, okay, it will always be too easy to hide the pension benefits. That defined contribution has this enormous clarity that you see exactly what you're putting in at the year that you're doing it, right? It's there. It's right there. It's perfectly observable. Where defined benefit, we can all pretend it doesn't cost us very much to give these staggeringly large benefits off in the future. And that's fundamentally unhealthy. And the point is, it's not just unhealthy for taxpayers. It's actually unhealthy for the cops and the teachers and the firemen as well, because the result of this system is that they're getting too much of their salary in the future rather than up front. Right? The result of this is that all the political calculus works to push everything off to some later day, whereas, at least lots of the cops and teachers that I know would be perfectly happy to have a bit more of that today, thank you very much, instead of 30 years in the future when they're doing something else. So I think that's one area which I feel quite strongly about. But the politics, I'm afraid I'll have to leave to somebody else. But yes, sir. The whole point is that cities match different people, and different people have different. I mean, there are things that places that I personally love, but different people love different things, and it's very hard to think that there should be one type of city. There are cities that function particularly well. So I'm quite comfortable lauding Singapore as a model of pristine management, and it is a model of pristine management. I mean, the roads are superb, the education. I mean, how crazy! I'm an American. I teach my 6-year-old with the Singapore math books. right? How odd it is that we, the birthplace of public education, the land of Horace Mann, I'm importing my math teaching stuff from Singapore. But for me, I like a little more chaos in my city than Singapore. I actually think it's probably okay for people to be able to chew gum. And you know, there are trade-offs on this, you know, and so it's you know, but it's easy to see why many people do in fact like Singapore, and it's easy to see why many people love Paris, and I certainly do as well, and I love Chicago, and I see a lot to like in Atlanta. I mean, I've been here, it seems like about 4 or 5 times over the last 5 years, and I've always thought it's a great city full of smart, interesting people. The question was about crime. Now, if we went back to the 1970s and early 1980s, actually through the crack epidemic, it felt at that point in time that actually crime was the most intractable urban problem. That in fact it was the big devil that was stopping cities from coming back as being places of pleasure. And then starting in the 90s, crime started dropping dramatically. Some part of this our police surely deserve credit for. New York, for example, put more significant number of cops on the beat, and that does have an impact. We also massively incarcerated a young population, right? And while that did reduce crime, it did so at an awful human cost. And I think the problem isn't that we don't know how to control crime. Those steps did in fact control crime, although I think there was also a lot of luck. And there's a lot of just, you know, social things that account for crime that are nothing to do with anything government says, and we've been lucky as well as having these policies. But as we go forward, I think the real need is to figure out ways to reduce crime that don't involve locking up so many young, I hesitate to be sexist about this, but men, because in fact it is our gender that is the one that is responsible overwhelmingly for the social problems of the world. And in fact, handling young men is difficult, right? And you know, anyone who's been a young man, and that looks like roughly half of you, should, if you're honest, remember that you were probably a little difficult yourself at 16 or 17. And I certainly was. That requires management. And I think one of the great tragedies is that we've convinced ourselves that the crime problem is solved because the murder rates are way down in many of our cities. But we've done so in a way that I think is fundamentally unacceptable. And I think that what we need to do is figure out ways to innovate, exactly as you've suggested, in ways that, you know, involve keeping crime levels low while locking up fewer people. And I think that's the great challenge going forward. And I wish that I had a silver bullet. You know, I wish I was able to say, as I am with pensions, with full confidence, just define contribution and be done with it. I have no such silver bullets. I talk about this in the book in terms of self-protecting urban innovation. And the example that I give is John Snow figuring out how cholera works by wandering around London in the 1850s and actually seeing how the epidemic unfolds, and sort of cities providing the information that solves their own problem. And certainly one view of community policing is that it's about that type of information flows. So I certainly think that that's right, and certainly better information is one of the tools for making this work. So yes, sir. I think this is there's certainly a tipping point, multiple equilibria thing that goes on, and you know, I think certainly one of the goals of the book was to make the case that there's a lot in cities that we should cherish and that we should be proud of, and I think that's so. That being said, there really are differences in terms of at least the scores between many large city school districts and suburban school districts, and I think it's not going to be enough to just change perceptions. I mean, a good ad campaign is not going to do it. I mean, we actually need to do the hard work on the ground of making the schools more functional. Yes, sir. I think actually the long run story of the Route 128 corridors, it proved to be fairly sterile in the long run, whereas the sort of area around Kendall Square and MIT has actually proved to be much more fertile. I should let you finish. Sorry, I got so excited by your question, I had to leap in. I think that this is a great question and an important point. I mean, many of the most important idea flows are very, very local. Right, sort of think about, you know, advertising in New York. Think about the Googleplex. On the other hand, Silicon Valley, it proves that you actually can. It's certainly very connected. It's very connected by face-to-face contact. But of course, it does occur at lower density. It is actually a car-based area, and there is a cost to that, which is that in some sense, Silicon Valley is able to get, you know, lots of interactions in car-based densities by having just one particular industry that really dominates that area. And that may prove to be perfectly feasible in the long run, but certainly historically we've seen lots of strengths that have come from inter-industry fertilization, and it sort of feels as if Silicon Valley perhaps lacks that, and that's the risk that it has. On the other hand, it has this glorious climate that will presumably continue to attract many of the most productive Americans to want to be there. In terms of cities and suburbs, in terms of much of the data, I talk about metropolitan areas because that's sort of the usual thing for talking about productivity. It doesn't particularly matter for productivity, although it does certainly for the environment and for fun, where you happen to lay your head, right? I mean, I think of myself as leading a half-urban existence, right? I mean, I sleep in a suburb and have all the bad emissions behavior to go along with it, but I certainly learn everything I learn in a city surrounded by people, and it's also where I take my children to play on the weekends, and it's where in some sense I think of myself as living my non-sleeping life, even though I do in fact lay my head in the woods of sorts. Yes, sir, in back. If you look at the 10 largest American cities in 1950, cities, 8 of them have lost 20% or more of their population since then. Okay, only New York and LA have actually gained population. And 3 of them, Cleveland, Detroit, and St. Louis, have lost more than half of their population since 1950. These are cities, not metropolitan areas. The metropolitan areas have done better, but these cities are enormously pained. And the way that this is similar to this other things that I've talked about. I mean, the story that I tell about them is that they followed, the reason for Detroit's decline is that it followed a model that was at odds with both the historic city and the future city. That if you think about the great success of cities in the 18th century, you think about London or Birmingham or New York in 1790, they succeed by having small firms, smart people, and global connections. Right? This is how the thing operates. And the city thrives on those things because the city is facilitating the connections of those groups. They're facilitating the small firms that work with each other. They're facilitating the connection to the outside world. That's what's making them successful. It turns out the same 3 things are leading to success today. Right? We haven't talked about it much, but average firm size is a very strong predictor of job growth across metropolitan areas. I've at least interpreted this as saying something about sort of a culture of entrepreneurship in a place, and this is an idea that went back to the great Ben Chinitz, who talked about why New York and Pittsburgh were having different fortunes in 1960, where New York seemed to be doing better than Pittsburgh. And he argued it was a result of the culture of entrepreneurship created by New York's garment industry, where the barriers to entry were very, very small, whereas U.S. Steel bred company men. I think he used the word bred. I think we try not to use that in economics anymore. But that was his story. There seems to be some truth to that. Now, let's think about Detroit for a second. So Detroit in 1900 looks a lot like Silicon Valley in the 1970s. There's sort of a genius entrepreneur on every street corner. There's Ford, there's Billy Durant off in Flint, I guess, the Fisher brothers, David Dunbar, Buick. Smart people borrowing each other's ideas, supplying each other with goods and financing, all of whom are trying to come up with a new thing. Right? And they do it. And they do this amazing thing of producing a cheap automobile. Right? But they do it in a way that's fundamentally counter to the way that cities work. They do it by creating these mass, vertically integrated factories that can survive by hiring people with less formal education. So you've created a model. Think Ford's River Rouge, giant brick walls, right? The whole thing vertically integrated. Thousands of people who are given good jobs, and that's a great thing that River Rouge did. But it creates a city that's very low on formal education. That model, right? Big plants, walled off from the world, less skilled workers, or at least less formally skilled, less skilled at things other than their direct task, has proven to be a very bad model for urban regeneration. And when transportation costs plummeted, and when Detroit lost its cost advantages from the waterways, move the factories to right-to-work states. Heck, move car production someplace that's cheaper. Right? There's no reason why, there's no natural comparative advantage anymore for Detroit in production, and the city was not able to come up with ways to manage to regenerate itself because it had lost the small firms, smart people, and connections to the outside world that actually generate success. Which is not to say there always weren't, and there still are, thousands of really smart, great people in Detroit and other cities. But 11%, 12% of Detroit's population right now is college educated, as opposed to 27.5% for the country as a whole. And that's just an enormously heavy lift for any city to face, just an enormously heavy lift. what's to be done about it? What can be done about Detroit? I think the first thing that's important to remember is that I have not now, nor will I ever, suggest that the right course to do when there's human suffering is to let the market take its course. Right? That's not what I've ever suggested. That in fact we owe every child in America some degree of skill, some degree of education, and the possibility to walk to school on safe streets. And we have failed the children in these cities that, and that is a tremendous national disgrace in some level. That being said, it's not as if we necessarily need to try and bring manufacturing back to Detroit. Right? It's not as if Detroit will ever reach 1.9 million people again, and unwise infrastructure investments aimed at that will-o'-the-wisp are not helping those children. So when I think about Detroit, I guess I have the most hope for investments that are focused on the kids. I guess I have most. I went to a charter school in Detroit a couple of weeks ago. I wrote about it actually a little bit in my column today. It actually takes place in the old. It's called the Argonaut Building. It's the building where Harley Earl used to design GM's cars back in the glory days. And now there are kids there, right? And they're kids, and I don't know if this charter school is going to end up working or not working. We haven't seen any test scores yet. Who knows? But everyone seems to be working hard, and there seems to be some hope there. And I think that's at least what I would like to see, our core investments in, is to try and give those kids some degree of a future. And that's in terms of the federal and the philanthropic energy. That's what I would like to see the most investment in going forward, because I think we certainly deserve to give them more than we have. Yes, sir. I think growing cities need more infrastructure. Typically, they have a lot of demand relative to the amount of infrastructure. I don't think infrastructure is any kind of a magic bullet in Detroit. I just don't think it's what Detroit lacks in any way, shape, or form. I think Detroit has a lot of infrastructure. In some sense, the vision that I'm pushing forward, I think that's in some sense, one of the critical messages of the book, is that cities basically aren't structures, they're people. And that those structures are only really important insofar as they provide some critical human need. And absolutely, we should think about what things we can do to eliminate the things that are blocking entrepreneurship in Detroit and those things that are making it less appealing to be there. But I think thinking that there's any infrastructure investment that will make a huge difference in the city seems to me to be wildly implausible. After all, we've gone down that route for 60 years. We've gone down that route for 60 years, and we have failed the children while we're doing so. And yes, ma'am. No, I mean, it depends on what public transportation also we're talking about, right? Either that says a s'more or one more question. I think it says one more question, not s'mores. I hate to disappoint those of you who expected s'mores tonight, but it's not happening. Public transportation is obviously an important thing that cities can provide. That's one of their assets, right? That's part of what makes cities relatively green, is the fact that you don't have to drive anywhere. That being said, we need to be smart about public transportation. There's a cliche, and this is not my work. This is the work of sort of 40 years of transportation economists at Harvard. Many of whom were deeply pro-public transportation. But the cliche, that the old line was that 50 years of research can be boiled down to 4 words: bus good, train bad. That was the old line. I don't know that I would in any sense agree with that all the time. But to get trains to make sense, you need very high density levels, right? And that's the sort of thing that the transportation engineers will always say to you. Whereas buses, if you give them a dedicated line, and the dedicated line is crucial, they need to actually not be competing with space with cars. But buses can move awfully quickly. Right? And you can, there are all sorts of things that can be done in terms of bus design that are important, and it's a very flexible thing. I think particularly buses become appealing relative to trains in areas where we're not exactly sure what the future will look like. So if you're looking at a city like New York, where things are relatively static, right? Trains kind of make sense. But I was very hostile to the idea, for example, of spending, I forget how much it was going to be, but putting down some sort of a rail line in Detroit, in New Orleans after Katrina. It seemed to me like that an area in which it was enormously difficult to predict what New Orleans was going to look like over the next five years, that buses can be great. So I'm a big fan of public transportation. I'm a big fan of enabling people to get around without a car for every adult. But I think much of the future lies in better buses rather than, at least in lower density areas, investing in trains. One last thing, though, that is important here, that buses make a broader point that I haven't actually brought up yet. it is often, when people talk about the downsides of cities, the fact that cities have poor people in them is often seen as being some terrible thing about cities. Okay? It's not. It's actually a sign that cities are succeeding. Because in fact, cities don't make people poor, they attract poor people. They attract poor people with economic opportunity and with public transportation and with the ability to get around without a car for every adult. And in fact, some of my work on public transportation finds that poverty rises in areas where you build rail lines. Right? You build a subway stop, poverty goes up nearby. Does that mean that those subway stops are actually making anyone poor? That would be a ridiculous hypothesis, right? Of course they're not making people poor. They're actually attracting people who have less means because they can get around more quickly with public transportation, and that's something to be cherished about public transportation. That's a good thing about it. It's very dangerous, and I made this point very strongly about the stimulus. It's very dangerous to have things like infrastructure, or I would say, in fact, environmental actions, justified as being stimulus, because I think it confuses things. And in fact, it is very difficult to do. I mean, I actually do believe, despite my comments about the monorail, I actually do believe that this country needs some forms of infrastructure, but it's actually impossible to do infrastructure quickly and wisely. That you actually need to do it slowly and carefully and actually do the cost-benefit analysis and plan for it and not wrap it up in some magic about job creation. And I think the same thing is true, in fact, about green investments, that it absolutely makes sense for us to think about things that will reduce the carbon intensity of our energy, but that to then sell it as also being a jobs program makes very little sense to me. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if you're actually able to produce super solar panels that will involve, huge reductions in carbon emissions, but they have to be made in, Tibet for some reason, I've got no problem with that, right? I mean, that's not something to be hated. And I think I'll just end on that, although I'll try to give it a slightly more uplifting note, other than the solar panels in Tibet, which is that we are living in a more globalized, connected world. We're living in a world in which America will be a smaller share of the world economy. And that's actually something to be wished for, right? It's a good thing that people in India and China and Africa are becoming wealthier. But as a result, we need to be smarter and we need to be connected to that outside world. And that promise of a wealthier world, that promise of a more globalized world, that promise of a more connected world is a world that inevitably leads to our cities. And it's because of that increasing connectedness that I have just tremendous belief in the ability of our cities to help make all of us, help lift all of mankind, whether or not you actually like living in a city or not, but to make all of our lives better. So thank you very much for your time.